in der Nation mobilisierten, die zu allen Zeiten nicht die Mehrheit, sondern die Minderheit ausgemacht haben.
Dialectic of Enlightenment, one of the foundational texts around what we now know as the Frankfurt School in the larger field of critical theory. A foundational text that would undeniably influence a new set of cultural theory, new lenses on how we view philosophy, society, subjectivity, and ideology throughout the 20th and even 21st century. To understand the Dialectic of Enlightenment is to directly understand the backdrop from which it was written, which was, in many ways, written in the most turbulent time in human history, around the beginnings of World War II. With the global rise of socialist movements, existing socialist states, the rise of nationalism and fascism, and the new shaky ground in which liberalism faced across the globe. Clearly, given the shaky ground that liberal democracies faced, Enlightenment, the results of the intellectual movement in the 17th and 18th century, something that Adorno and Horkheimer took aim at, as a philosophy or order which was meeting its demise, or at the very least being questioned as an ideological guideline that dictated the future of humanity, things we would initially think of as reason and individual liberty. Yet to Adorno and Horkheimer, Enlightenment was arguably best realized by Francis Bacon, not necessarily as a system of lofty humanistic goals of individual liberty and reason, but as a larger system that synthesized knowledge and power as one, as the ability to destroy human fears, anxieties, and a flipping of nature over man to man over nature. But Adorno and Horkheimer thought that this very enlightenment played itself out in many ways that humans couldn't have really imagined, to an extent and brutal scale that philosophers in the past couldn't have thought possible. If enlightenment was to free men from superstition and myth, why was fascism on the rise? If enlightenment was to create a world built upon reason, why did we experience the two largest human conflicts in history? To Adorno and Horkheimer, if we are to take Bacon seriously regarding the Enlightenment, it requires one thing, that being domination. A domination that continually occurs and transcends initial focus of humanism, the individual, and newer notions of freedom. And with this ideological progression, or in more accurate terms to the text, regression, we must start at the beginning, with the historical battle of enlightenment and myth. Here is where the body of the Dialectic of Enlightenment begins. So, let's get into just that. This is the Dialectic of Enlightenment, just in video form. Here we reach enlightenment as myth and myth as enlightenment, which is precisely part of the dialectic within the title, Dialectic of Enlightenment, that is being referred to. That through the process of time, enlightenment and myth has become a synthesized category, something that was once at odds with one another, but now has come together as a unity. First, we should focus on the immediate logic of this. Enlightenment sought to create a world that does away with tradition and works towards a world of reason and scientific rationality, one where we can clearly understand, where we have the security of looking at the world and universals, where we can make sense of things beyond the playful mythical subtext of the past. Through this subjective playfulness that myth allowed us, the Enlightenment does something similar, except rather than the artistic playfulness, it's cynicism and distant questioning. With Enlightenment, everything is on the chopping block. Adorno and Horkheimer point out things such as human rights, sublime ideals of human worth, from a system that is supposed to promote agency and freedom, only now does so through a negative form of liberty that suppresses other human agency. Adorno and Horkheimer state, every attempt to break natural thraldom because nature is broken enters all the more deeply into natural enslavement, hence the course of European civilization. Abstraction, the tool of enlightenment, treats its objects as did fate, the notion of which it rejects, it liquidates them. What Adorno and Horkheimer mean by a broken nature is that nature doesn't offer a complete understanding as is. It must be inspected. Same with humans. Thus, with enlightenment, we abstract nature, abstract people. Therefore, nature, people become tools, They become abstract resources that can be safely categorized, resources to build up society via their labor, and resources to be understood, to be abstracted. This is where Adorno and Horkheimer claim that Enlightenment becomes totalitarian. It abstracts, and only a central abstract understanding can be accepted of things. Humanity, as something innately worthwhile and sublime, is thrown away, as the rule book of reason, rationality, science deems it so. It becomes homogenizing. Whatever might be different is made the same. Adorno and Horkheimer bring up the Hitler Youth as such example, an organization, a German people who tout themselves as superior, a difference among others, above other people across the globe. Yet, they all become a homogeneous sameness around each other. Only certain quote-unquote rational ideals of self and society are now permitted. Thus, the machine that was the Hitler Youth in fascist Germany. Here, Adorno and Horkheimer say, man imagines himself free from fear when there is no longer anything unknown. Here to Adorno and Horkheimer, they argue the ideological function of enlightenment starts from a negation, a central anxiety around a lack of certain cohesion and understanding. See where the similarity to myth comes in? People of the past brought myth into the equation for the same reason, understanding and meaning, as to elaborate and to understand this existence that we are thrusted into. Adorno and Horkheimer bring in Homer's Odyssey to visualize this. How myth and enlightenment have already shared paths. The Odyssey encapsulates this very dialectic of enlightenment. To Adorno and Horkheimer, Odysseus, the main hero, is the prototype for the contemporary bourgeois individual. In the Odyssey, Odysseus cheats Polyphemus as to escape the cave. The story of Odysseus is one that throws himself away, sacrifices his prior self, his ideals, so that he can survive and bear and endure the journey forward. The process has been the same within nearly all walks of modern society. Abandon your ideals so you can cope and endure. In liberal democracies, you must go to work so you can endure and survive another day, and you don't starve. Maybe you can become a powerful individual, employ people, yet only to ensure that capital survives in the end as the main function. In a fascist society, you can sacrifice yourself in the name of a mythological ideal of your quote-unquote people, your homeland. Here we see that myth already presupposed Enlightenment ideals of the grand agency of the individual, the freedom to choose, to act, yet become enslaved by said freedom. Thus, Adorno and Horkheimer's claim, myth is enlightenment, and enlightenment is myth. The important thing to note here is that Adorno and Horkheimer aren't making sociological claims upon mere political economy and hardened claims on the basis of economics like what we may see in a traditional Marxian analysis. Rather, they are making a claim around and of ideology and its function, a larger social psychology, and of course, with the ideological and psychological ethos being enlightenment. The importance here is that while you may be a worker or an owner of large sums of capital, it doesn't matter. The story and mythology of self-sacrifice prevails in modern society. Thus, Adorno and Horkheimer claim that the result of this sacrifice is a continual alienation that is far more reaching than the Marxist notion of alienation in the labor process, as you can potentially change certain economic arrangements, which have been done to some extent, but different unpierced notions of enlightenment prevail across different economic systems around the globe. Say in something seen like the USSR, the United States, and fascist Germany, all resulting from certain modern Enlightenment presuppositions and the dialectical process it undergoes. Adorno and Horkheimer claim there is a level of positivism that stems from this, but to Adorno and Horkheimer, this positivism has a dual meaning to it, or they use two existing definitions of this very positivism. One, a system of philosophy where every rational assertion can be scientifically verified or proved. The second is that this positivism itself is an authority, where ideology is something that is true by default and questioning it goes against this very quote-unquote objective foundations. Here Adorno and Horkheimer point out the unquestioned nature of enlightenment and its ability to transcend time and continual critique. Ultimately, even among the critique of Enlightenment, is its unfettered acceptance of it. Adorno and Horkheimer point out that philosophers such as Nietzsche and Kant pierced the veil of Enlightenment. Nietzsche saw the dialectic of Enlightenment as a system of future enslavement. Kant saw the short-sighted nature of pure reason. Yet, even the academics who celebrate and teach individuals such as Nietzsche and Kant hardly even contend with their immediate subject matter as it relates to day-to-day functions. Adorno and Horkheimer bring up logical positivists and philosophy departments, who were among many responsible for kicking continental philosophers out of philosophy departments. A helpful way of looking at Enlightenment ideology is to look at it as a realism. Say something like Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, which was undeniably influenced by the dialectic of Enlightenment. We have covered capitalist realism, link above. A realism, an ideology that only gets stronger as it's continually critiqued. In the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant utilized a system of moral law, a system of respect, sublime forms of human love, all as a guideline for human organization. Yet, within the very same reason that brings us to conclusions of this moral law Kant proposed, we see the dialectic of mechanical harshness, something that goes beyond the sublime love of humans and mutual appreciation into a realm where we disregard humans as per reason allows us. This here is where Adorno and Horkheimer claim that fascism, despite contradictory notions to Enlightenment ideals, is ironically the highest order of Enlightenment itself. Here we get into the culture industry, arguably the most famous portion in Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of Enlightenment. Here we bring said ideology, the process of enlightenment, into culture and its material consequences, namely in Western capitalist countries. This is where stuff gets really interesting and, sadly, incredibly grim. A grimness precisely because of its persistent relevance throughout the years. Seriously, if the concept of the culture industry is new to you, by the end of this, it will certainly change your immediate perception of things. With the section of the culture industry, Enlightenment as mass deception, there is a large subtext that we should get into. Adorno and Horkheimer released this book in the 40s. Thus, a lot has happened throughout the world. America was slowly becoming a world powerhouse. World War II started with Nazi Germany's mass annexation of Europe, and the Soviet Union, aside from their role in World War II, underwent their own industrial revolution in the years prior. What has been consistent is this: change was everywhere, and among certain parts of the world, revolutionary change at that, with one large outlier, the United States. Thus, the immediate question: in the early 21st century, with horrid working conditions, a growing wealth divide, despite a growing population of global workers revolting around the globe, why didn't the United States or Western countries embrace similar post-capitalist systems seen across the globe? And further, how is fascism succeeding alongside socialism as a post-capitalist system? Here is where the culture industry comes in. To Adorno and Horkheimer, the basis of the culture industry is in its very name. It's a supplanting or merging of culture into industrial or capitalist context. Thus, the focus is on the newer reproduction of art that was taking place in the 21st century. Films, radio, and magazines make up a system which is uniform as a whole and in every part. Even the aesthetic activities of political opposites are one in their enthusiastic obedience to the rhythm of the iron system. The decorative industrial management buildings and exhibition centers in authoritarian countries are much the same as anywhere else. The huge gleaming towers that shoot up everywhere are outward signs of the ingenious planning of international concerns, toward which the unleashed entrepreneurial system, whose monuments are a mass of gloomy houses and business premises in grimy, spiritless cities, was already hastening. Even now, the older houses just outside the concrete city centers look like slums, and the new bungalows on the outskirts are at one with the flimsy structures of world fairs in their praise of technical progress and their built-in demand to be discarded after a short while like empty food cans. Yet, the city housing projects designed to perpetuate the individual as a supposedly independent unit in a small hygienic dwelling make him all the more subservient to his adversary, the absolute power of capitalism. This passage arguably sums up the culture industry more distinctly than anything else in the book. Art is now being systematized, but it's not only the systemization of art, it's different types of art, newer technology being systematically synthesized into one and the same narratives. Radio and cinema often showcase stories of the individual, overcoming said adversity, the same repackaged Greek myth like we see in the Odyssey. Flavors of the same recycled tragedy, all while manifesting the physical form of teacher and listener, subject and authority. We gather at a theater to witness the screen speak to us. Numerous people gather around a single radio. This mimics a sociological order of a governance of few, of the many, a top-down hierarchy. Like in typical psychoanalytic theory, the phallus may represent itself as a mode of orthodox male power in normal day-to-day objects. Thus, the form in which these newer modes of entertainment work, film, television, materially mimic a hierarchical form. Here we are getting into Adorno and Horkheimer's ideas on how this culture industry works. Adorno and Horkheimer utilize Kant's idea and process of schematism to make sense of this. In the most abstract way than how Adorno and Horkheimer use it, schematism being how the mind communicates with objects and other structures around us, in order for humans to come up with an ideal of reason. How to reason and cognitively navigate given said external structures and how we experience things day to day to begin with. But they don't just use Kant, they use newer developmental foundations of psychoanalysis via Freud. They synthesize and bring Freud into the mix. His ideas on the unconscious mind, how we suppress ourselves, our desires, in order to fit within a society. See where this is going? In culture and in entertainment, we cognitively pick up on the form in which it is presented to us. And like the previous examples, it's presented in a form that mimics hierarchical structures, a single TV screen controlling a crowd of viewers as such example. This very form of organization, viewership, creates the bounds in which we can now do art, which is only within certain narrow parameters, with the main parameter being profit and capital on top of it. And, again, there is an intrinsic sublime validity in this, a psychological realism that is difficult to break and mediate as a normal person who works a 9-to-5 job, which is also how the culture industry works. To dissect it, it takes time. To elaborate, it takes time. Time that in Western capitalism is better spent on wealth accumulation or labor. In essence, the culture industry, as a system, will continue to manufacture art and entertainment within these bounds, as newer ideological systematic forms of art permeate into our psyche. Thus, art becomes the same, even when it tries to stand out. Take aesthetics and fashion. In today's world, one phenomenon that always comes up is that there is a uniform aesthetic to abide by if you want to look different. The alternative aesthetic of people with tattoos, new niche clothing, ironically becomes the same and uniform. It becomes something that is easy to identify with. This sameness and constant co-opting are also the grounds for which Mark Fisher argues that every alternative presence or artistic creation is ironically already the mainstream. I'll let you sit on that one for a bit. We have only talked about the form in which art plays into our psyche, but little on the tangible content of art itself. Adorno and Horkheimer bring up how art is now abstracted. Like how Enlightenment abstracts humanity and nature, newer creation, technology, worth is now a fulfillment of mere numbers, rather than aesthetic worth, creativity, and even utility. Regarding art and newer creation, connoisseurship, craftsmanship goes to the wayside in favor of numerical hierarchy. Adorno and Horkheimer bring up automobiles as such example. You must have a V6 six-cylinder engine rather than a V4. A certain film must have a set amount of known stars, have a specific romantic sequence throughout in order to fulfill set standardized quotas that the industry now demands. This is all to the benefit of mechanical reproduction within capitalism that further entrenches consumers in existing class relations. Car manufacturers make vehicles, specific models according to income. There's the economic model, the higher class model. It's not only that art becomes more and more uniform, but that the relation within consumers and class does as well. The idea isn't to flatten out or to allow tangible access to all types of goods. Rather, it's that if you are poor, don't worry, a corporation will tailor a product just for you. Art will become tailored to your class relation as well. But it's important to note, and something so many seem to miss regarding the culture industry, is that it's not just economics or political economy. Of course, the culture industry is propped up because it must turn a profit, that it must sacrifice originality, artistry, in order to make as much profit as possible. But this truly is the most surface understanding, or rather, misunderstanding of the culture industry that I see. It's not just that corporate art is entirely based off of profit, or that truly experimental artists are almost always screwed economically, but rather, there's a cyclical ideology that reinforces this phenomenon. It's ideology. Adorno and Horkheimer speak on this here. The whole world is made to pass through the filter of the culture industry, the old experience of the moviegoer, who sees the world outside as an extension of the film he has just left, because the latter is intent upon reproducing the world of everyday perceptions, is now the producer's guideline. The more intensely and flawlessly his techniques duplicate empirical objects, the easier it is today for the illusion to prevail that the outside world is the straightforward continuation of that presented on the screen. This purpose has been furthered by mechanical reproduction since the lightning takeover by the sound of film. Wonder why, in 2021, the culture industry is arguably at its most relevant point. Do you see the timeline of reproduction that's going on here? You have a material object, a material film, and then it ideologically transfers itself to you. Why we see monopolies such as Disney pump out the constant sameness in Marvel movies, and other constantly recycled mechanical films and television. It's not just their thirst for profit, rather, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, their quote-unquote thirst isn't necessarily conscious. Rather, it's the result of the structure that is capitalism, the culture industry, and the molding of our desires in the first place. This is why, to Adorno and Horkheimer, the focus isn't really on dull art pieces, individual corporate characters who spearhead said mechanical art, but the industry itself and the ideological reinforcement that follows. It's not good enough to critique said Marvel movies. It's not necessarily good enough to tell individuals not to consume said tailored corporate art. It's the industry itself. From this very process of enlightenment, the foundational creation of a culture industry in Western democracies, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, arguably one of the largest symptoms that has reached its highest point is anti-Semitism, a symptom being a social pathology that stems from a systematic pathology itself. We see the process of enlightenment has created a global bourgeois class in which many Jewish individuals found themselves in, within a framework of capitalist economics. Therein, alienation within the labor process grew. A scapegoat had to be created. Instead of piercing the veil of class relations, fundamental ways in which economic systems operate, there has been a reversion back to essentialist notions of race. Jewish individuals continually become the target, rationale of larger systemic woes. Yet, the important part here is that Adorno and Horkheimer claim that the largest incubators of anti-Semitism stem from the bourgeois class themselves, despite certain Jewish individuals being within it. It's not just normal working class people projecting specific insecurities, but a ruling class of people attempting to hide an ideology of domination. Your alienated place within the labor process, economic woes, low pay, a ridding of certain sublime forms of culture. Here, a bourgeois class knows the struggle of common people and pin these negative feelings onto Jewish individuals. And while anti-Semitism has existed for hundreds of years, The new anti-Semitism that has been most pervasive isn't over religious qualms, but now racial ones, where Jewish individuals threaten a cohesive and national unity seen in places such as Nazi Germany. Thus, it's not really just pushing Jewish people outside of specific borders, but exterminating them altogether. This anti-Semitism marks the downfall of social civilization to Adorno and Horkheimer. Cultural education spread with bourgeois property. It forced paranoia into the dark corners of society and the soul. Since the real emancipation of mankind did not take place with the enlightenment of the mind, education itself became diseased. This is why Adorno and Horkheimer find fascism to be one of the final forms of enlightenment. It separates, abstracts, categorizes nature, people, props up an economic system that further reinforces said separation, then creates a reaction, a reactive element such as fascism. Here we have hit the bounds of reason. Reason supplants itself. Human continuity ruptures, breaks apart, all in the name of a mechanical reproductive element seen within capitalism. Thank you guys so much for watching and making it to the end. I have a huge request. If these videos are something you find worthwhile, consider pledging a few dollars on Patreon and the YouTube member section. It's the only way I can keep this entire thing rolling. But before we go, I want to thank these special patrons: Jose David Guevara, Stacy Solano, Seveth9, Kate, J.R. Ogg, and Jacques Olivier Perch. I think I pronounced that correct. You all go way above and beyond, and I can't say thank you enough. That's all for this video. I hope to see you all in the next.